This is the entire history of ancient Japan. Japan is one of the most fascinating countries in the world, and if you've ever visited, you may have noticed that it's full of ancient temples and shrines and other historical sites. That's because Japan has a long and complicated past, which we're going to try and summarize here. So let's get started. We'll start with a brief overview of the country's geography. Japan is an archipelago, meaning it's made up of a group of islands. The main island is called Honshu, and it's surrounded by 4 smaller islands: Hokkaido, Shikoku, Kyushu, and Okinawa. This archipelago is located off the eastern coast of Asia, which has led some historians to refer to it as the Pacific Island Nation. Japan is also home to some of the tallest mountains in the world, including Mount Fuji, which is the highest peak in the country at 12,000 feet. Now that we have a basic understanding of Japan's geography, we can start exploring its history. According to legend, the first inhabitants of Japan were a group of people who arrived on the island of Honshu around 14,000 years ago. These people were hunter-gatherers, and they lived in small clans or tribes. Life was difficult in this time period, and the people had to constantly be on the lookout for food and shelter. Around 10,000 years ago, the Jomon period came to an end, and the Yayoi period began. During this time, the people of Japan began to farm the land and raise livestock. They also developed new tools and weapons made of metal. This allowed them to live more settled lives and to defend themselves from predators. One of the most significant developments during the Yayoi period was the introduction of rice cultivation. Rice became an iron fist. They established a strict social order, and any challenges to their authority were met with swift and brutal punishment. Despite the brutality of the shogunate, it was also a time of great accomplishment. The Japanese developed new weapons and tactics that made them formidable warriors. They also expanded their empire to include much of Korea and parts of China. In the 16th century, Japan was introduced to firearms by Portuguese traders. This would have a major impact on Japanese warfare, and it would eventually lead to the downfall of the shogunate. In 1543, a Portuguese ship carrying guns and other European goods arrived in Japan. The Japanese quickly realized the potential of these new weapons, and they began to produce their own firearms. This gave them a huge advantage in warfare, and it allowed them to conquer much of China and Korea. But the use of guns also had unintended consequences. It destabilized the country, and it led to a series of civil wars. In 1600, a battle took place between the Tokugawa clan and the Toyotomi clan. The battle was fought over control of Japan, and it was one of the bloodiest conflicts in Japanese history. The Tokugawa clan emerged victorious, and they established the Tokugawa Shogunate in 1603. This shogunate would last for the next 260 years, and it would be the last shogunate of Japan. The Tokugawa Shogunate was a time of peace and stability for Japan. The shoguns implemented a number of policies that helped to strengthen the economy and improve the lives of the peasants. They also kept Japan isolated from the rest of the world, and this isolation helped to preserve Japanese culture. But as the Tokugawa Shogunate came to an end, Japan was about to undergo a massive transformation. In 1853, Commodore Matthew Perry arrived in Japan with a fleet of U.S. warships. He demanded that the Japanese open their country to trade, or else he would use force. The Japanese had no choice but to agree, and this event is known as the Black Ships Incident. In 1868, a group of Japanese rebels overthrew the Tokugawa Shogunate and restored power to the emperor. This event is known as the Meiji Restoration. The Meiji Restoration was a turning point in Japanese history. It marked the end of feudalism and the beginning of modernization. The new government quickly set about the task of making Japan into a modern, industrialized country. They created a new constitution, they built new factories and railroads, and they modernized the army and navy. This rapid modernization turned Japan into a major power in Asia, and it set the stage for the country's future growth. So there you have it, the entire history of ancient Japan in just 100 seconds. I hope you enjoyed this brief overview of one of the most fascinating countries in the world. If you want to learn more about ancient Japan, I highly recommend checking out some of the resources that I've linked in the description below. Imagine a time before written history, a time when humans lived in small nomadic groups, constantly on the move, surviving by hunting wild animals and gathering plants. This was the reality for most of our existence. But around 14,000 years ago, a small group of these early humans settled down in what is now Japan. They would become known as the Jomon people, and their story will take us back to the very beginnings of human civilization. Join me as we explore this ancient culture and uncover the secrets of their way of life. To understand the Jomon period, it's important to know that at this time, Japan consisted of many smaller islands. However, the first humans to arrive in Japan likely came from what we now call Korea. These early immigrants would have arrived via land bridges that connected the two land masses during the last ice age, which ended around 12,800 years ago. It marked the beginning of a new era, with rising sea levels that ultimately led to the formation of the Japanese archipelago as we know it today. The ancestors of the Jomon people were hunter-gatherers who relied on the bounty of the natural world to sustain them. They roamed the forests and coastal areas, hunting wild animals such as deer and wild boar, and gathering shellfish and nuts. Their days were spent in pursuit of food, and their nights were spent around a fire, huddled with their families, telling stories and sharing meals. Life was hard, but it was also full of wonder and adventure. And these early Japanese ancestors thrived in this environment for thousands of years. But over time, the climate began to change, and with it, the availability of food sources fluctuated. This led to competition for resources and ultimately to conflict between groups. In response, some groups began to experiment with new ways of living. One such group was the Jomon people. The term Jomon itself means ancient or archaic times and refers to a period in Japanese prehistory spanning from around 14,000 to 300 BCE. This was a time when humans began to settle down and plant crops, raising livestock and living in permanent settlements. This was a radical departure from the nomadic lifestyle of their ancestors, and it marked the beginning of civilization as we know it. Initially, the Jomon people continued the traditions of their ancestors by gathering shellfish and other food sources from the coastal areas. However, they quickly learned that they could supplement their diet by growing rice and wheat. They also began to raise pigs and chickens, providing them with a more reliable source of protein. With a more stable food supply, the Jomon people were able to establish permanent settlements. These settlements were typically located near the coast or along riverbanks, taking advantage of the fertile soil and access to water. The settlements were small, typically consisting of a few dozen people, and they were made up of a variety of structures, including huts, pit houses, and communal buildings. Life in these settlements was not without its challenges. The Jomon people had to contend with natural disasters such as floods and typhoons, as well as attacks from neighboring groups. But they were also able to enjoy a higher quality of life than their nomadic ancestors. They had access to a more reliable food supply, and they were able to develop more complex social structures and cultural traditions. As the Jomon people began to flourish, they started to develop new technologies to help them meet their growing needs. They created more advanced tools for farming and hunting, as well as new methods for storing and processing food. They also developed new artistic techniques, creating beautiful pottery and jewelry that celebrated their culture and traditions. One of the most notable achievements of the Jomon people was their development of pottery. Initially, they created simple, coarse pottery for practical use. But over time, they began to create more sophisticated and decorative pottery. Jomon pottery is known for its unique style, which often features geometric patterns, animal motifs, and a distinctive cord-marked texture. This pottery was not just functional, but also served as a form of art and a way to display the skills and creativity of the potters. In fact, the development of pottery was so significant that archaeologists use the appearance of cord-marked pottery to define the beginning of the Jomon period. As the Jomon people continued to thrive, they spread throughout the Japanese archipelago, establishing new settlements and bringing their culture and traditions with them. They adapted to different environments, developing new technologies and techniques to suit the local conditions. For example, they developed new types of rice cultivation along the coast, taking advantage of the natural salt content of the seawater to preserve the rice. They also developed more sophisticated fishing techniques, using nets and hooks to catch a wider variety of fish. As the Jomon people spread throughout Japan, they also interacted with other cultures, both indigenous and immigrant. This led to the exchange of ideas and technologies, which further enriched Jomon culture. For example, they came into contact with people from the Korean peninsula, who had developed new agricultural techniques and metalworking technologies. The Jomon people adopted some of these new technologies, such as the use of bronze tools, which allowed them to more efficiently clear forests and cultivate crops. They also developed a unique style of bronze mirrors, which became an important part of their culture and are still prized by collectors today. Despite their many achievements, the Jomon people were not immune to the forces of change that were shaping the world around them. Around 300 BCE, the Jomon way of life began to change rapidly. New groups of immigrants arrived in Japan, bringing with them new ideas and technologies. The Jomon people were forced to adapt or face the possibility of extinction. Over time, they assimilated with these new groups, giving rise to new cultures and civilizations. Although the Jomon period came to an end around 300 CE, their legacy lived on in the cultures that followed. Their innovations in agriculture, technology, and art laid the foundation for the development of Japanese civilization. Their cultural traditions, such as their spiritual beliefs and animistic practices, also had a lasting impact on Japanese culture. Now let's talk about something fascinating about the Jomon culture, their spiritual beliefs. The Jomon people were deeply connected to the natural world around them, and they believed that the spirits of animals, plants, and natural phenomena such as mountains and rivers were all interconnected and coexisted in harmony. They saw the world as a living, breathing entity, and they felt a sense of responsibility to care for it and live in balance with it. This worldview was reflected in their daily lives as they went about their daily activities. They would perform rituals and ceremonies to honor the spirits of the natural world and to ensure their continued fertility and abundance. For example, they may have performed a ritual before a hunt to ensure the safety of the animals they were pursuing. Similarly, they may have performed a ceremony after a successful harvest to give thanks to the spirits of the land and the rice. The Jomon people also believed that the spirits of their ancestors were present in the world around them, and they would often visit their graves and offer prayers and gifts to them. They believed that their ancestors could provide them with guidance and protection, and that maintaining a connection with them was essential to their well-being. Overall, the religious beliefs of the Jomon people were an integral part of their culture, and they played a central role in their relationship with the natural world and their ancestors. Their animistic worldview and reverence for the natural world set the foundation for many of the spiritual beliefs that would develop in Japan over the centuries. This was a time when humans began to settle down and plant crops, raising livestock, and living in permanent settlements. This was a radical departure from the nomadic lifestyle of their ancestors, and it marked the beginning of civilization as we know it. As the Jomon people began to flourish, they started to develop new technologies to help them meet their growing needs. They created more advanced tools for farming and hunting, as well as new methods for storing and processing food. They also developed new artistic techniques, creating beautiful pottery and jewelry that celebrated their culture and traditions. One of the most notable achievements of the Jomon people was their development of pottery. What I find most fascinating about the Jomon people is their ability to adapt and thrive in a changing world. They were not the first inhabitants of the Japanese archipelago, but they were the first to develop a sedentary lifestyle and establish permanent settlements. They were able to do this by taking advantage of the abundant natural resources of the islands and by developing new technologies and techniques to meet their growing needs. For example, they developed new types of rice cultivation along the coast, taking advantage of the natural salt content of the seawater to preserve the rice. They also developed more sophisticated fishing techniques, using nets and hooks to catch a wider variety of fish. Additionally, their animistic beliefs and reverence for the natural world helped them to develop a deep connection to the land and resources of Japan. They understood the importance of living in harmony with the environment and taking only what they needed to survive. As we continue to explore the rich history of Japan, it's important to remember the contributions of the Jomon people and their lasting impact on the country's culture and traditions. They were a resilient and resourceful group of people who were able to thrive in a changing world. And their story is a reminder of the importance of preserving our cultural heritage and honoring the contributions of our ancestors. That concludes our journey through the Jomon period. If you enjoyed learning about this ancient culture, I invite you to subscribe, and together we can explore the fascinating world of history and uncover the mysteries of our past. Join me as we continue to explore the history of ancient Japan. This is part 5 in our series on the history of Japan. If you haven't watched the earlier episodes on the Jomon or Yayoi periods, go check those out to get caught up. But we're going to pick things off right here at the beginning of the Yayoi period around 300 BCE. So let's get started. So the Yayoi period is marked by huge changes for the people of Japan. Up until this point, they had lived as small-scale hunter-gatherers, but now wet rice agriculture from mainland Asia was introduced. This would change everything. The first agricultural villages began to pop up, and eventually these would develop into larger settlements. By the end of the Yayoi period, there were 250,000 people living in these settlements, and that's compared to only 25,000 in the previous Jomon period. With more food being produced came an increase in population, and with that population boom came social stratification. For the first time in Japanese history, there was enough wealth to go around, so that some people could actually become wealthy while others got left behind. This led to the creation of early Japanese kingdoms and also the beginnings of warfare between them. Metalworking also developed during the Yayoi period, starting with bronze and eventually moving into iron. It took 800 years for bronze to catch on in Japan, though, probably because it was hard to get the materials needed for smelting. Iron would take another 400 years after that. During the late Yayoi period, Japan also started developing its own unique culture. However, both before and during the Yayoi period, Japan was highly influenced by mainland Asian cultures, most notably China and Korea. And so the Yayoi period is split into two phases: early Yayoi, roughly 300 BCE to 100 CE, and late Yayoi, roughly 100 CE to 250 CE. These dates are just approximations, by the way, since there was no real calendar in Japan at this point. And Yayoi actually refers to a type of rice paddy, and not a historical period. The names come from the fact that archaeologists found a village from this period called Yayoi, near the city of Osaka. Anyways, early Yayoi saw the introduction of wet rice agriculture and other technologies such as the iron smelting furnace, the loom, and the sickle. Rice quickly became the staple food of Japan, and wet rice agriculture required large labor forces. Villagers would build elaborate irrigation systems and plant rice seedlings by hand. Then they would wait for the rice to grow over the summer, and then harvest it with sickles. The work was backbreaking, but the reward was worth it. Rice yields were high and it could be stored for a long time. Plus it had lots of calories and nutrients. This new technology allowed people to settle down and live in one place, rather than following herds of animals as they migrated around the land. Villages popped up all over the place and the population boomed. The next big development during early Yayoi was the formation of early Japanese kingdoms. The Yayoi people were organized into what scholars call a tribal system, which is a form of social organization where society is divided into a bunch of equal tribes, and each tribe has its own chief. The chiefs, however, weren't really kings like you might imagine. They were more like big brothers to their fellow villagers, helping everyone settle disputes and organizing work projects like building irrigation ditches. This was fine for a hunter-gatherer society, but as agriculture became more important, competition between settlements for land and resources increased, and so did the power of the chiefs. As a result, many of these chieftains grew into full-blown monarchs with loyal retainers and hereditary nobility. A few of these early monarchies included the Kingdom of Yamato, which existed somewhere in western Japan and may have been the first kingdom to mint coins. Then there was the Kingdom of Ionia, which existed in central Japan and traded with the Han dynasty. Then finally, there was the Kingdom of Shilla, which existed in southern Japan and would eventually become the largest kingdom in the region. These kingdoms were constantly fighting each other for supremacy, but they also cooperated with each other and with neighboring states on the Korean peninsula and in China. Early Yayoi saw trade networks spread throughout the Korean peninsula and China, and then expand to include Japan. New technologies and ideas flowed through these trade networks. The Kingdom of Shilla, for example, adopted the writing system of the Chinese Kingdom of Han. And speaking of China, the Han dynasty had taken control of much of northern Vietnam. In fact, the Vietnamese were originally called the Yue people, and they were a loose confederation of tribes. But when the Han invaded, they were forced to unite and fight back. The Yue people were decentralized and didn't have a strong central government. Also, they didn't have any kind of writing system and relied on the Chinese to keep written records of their interactions. When the Yue people defeated the Han, however, they broke apart again. This caused problems for the Japanese, who were now trading with the Vietnamese. The Japanese didn't have a written language either, and so they asked the Koreans to write down their interactions with the Vietnamese. However, the Koreans demanded too much money for their services, and so the Japanese decided to develop their own writing system. This is one of the legends surrounding the creation of the Japanese writing system anyways. As trade networks grew, cities grew as well. We've already talked about the importance of rice in Japanese culture, but it should also be mentioned that rice wine became popular during the Yayoi period as well. In fact, rice wine played a major role in religious ceremonies and festivals. Of course, you can't make rice wine without grain, which means that grain storage facilities were essential to every settlement. The most important buildings in these settlements were usually granaries used for storing rice and other grains. Eventually, though, settlements would begin to build large shrines to store sacred rice and conduct festivals. Shrines dedicated to rice personified as a deity were common, but so were shrines dedicated to local nature spirits. While religion continued to be animistic, meaning that the Japanese still worshipped spirits found in nature, the idea of an afterlife developed during the Yayoi period as well. Funerary urns have been found all over the place, and they suggest that the Yayoi people believed that the dead went to some kind of afterlife. Some scholars even argue that the first hint of Shintoism can be found in the religious practices of the Yayoi period, although that's hotly debated. Either way, burials became more elaborate during the Yayoi period. They would bury the dead with pottery and metalwork and occasionally human sacrifices. Speaking of metalwork, Yayoi saw the start of bronze and iron working in Japan. Bronze was first, but iron would quickly surpass it. Bronze was brought over from Korea and China and used to make ceremonial objects and weapons. Iron, on the other hand, was smelted in Japan starting around 50 CE. Iron was preferred over bronze because it was stronger, cheaper, and more accessible, while bronze tools and weapons were reserved for the elite class. Iron was used for farming tools and weapons for everyone else. It was during the Yayoi period that bronze mirrors with intricate designs also appeared in Japan, and these were typically associated with the upper classes. Finally, let's talk about art during the Yayoi period. Pottery styles varied depending on the region, but generally the style was simple and elegant. Plain earthenware was made by throwing clay on a wheel and then adding simple geometric designs. There wasn't much artistic expression in the pottery, and that would have to wait till the Kofun period. Yayoi sculpture was also pretty simple. Most sculptures were Buddhist, and the subject matter followed what was popular in China and Korea. For example, one of the earliest Buddhist statues found in Japan was of the Bodhisattva Kannon, who was the embodiment of Avalokiteshvara's mercy. Yayoi, however, would end rather abruptly. Outside forces were causing massive upheaval on the Korean peninsula and in China, and Japan was swept up in it. The three kingdoms of Goguryeo, Baekje, and Silla fought each other for supremacy, and Silla eventually won. This What's up, guys? Today we're going to talk about the Kofun period in Japan, which lasted from 250 to 538 CE. For more information, check the description below for more information, and let's get into it. So to start off this period, it's characterized by three things. First of all, the emergence of a powerful warrior aristocracy. Secondly, giant burial mounds known as Kofun. And thirdly, the formation of the Yamato state and the first steps toward centralization. But before we can get into those three things, we have to start with the Yayoi period, which was from 300 BCE to 300 CE. The Yayoi period saw the introduction of rice cultivation and metalworking techniques like the wet rice cultivation from the Chinese and other stuff like bronze mirrors and swords from Korea. These new technologies allowed for greater agricultural productivity, population growth, and the emergence of social stratification. However, this was not uniform throughout the archipelago, and the northern and southern regions remained relatively isolated from one another and developed their own unique cultural traits. Northern Japan was influenced by the Korean peninsula, and southern Japan was influenced by the Chinese continent. Eventually, though, around the 3rd century, these two regions were united under one cultural sphere, largely due to the efforts of a group known as the Yamato clan. Now, the Yamato clan claimed descent from the gods and claimed control over the entire archipelago. They used their power to establish the Yamato state and begin the process of centralizing political power. They did this through a series of campaigns of conquest against local chieftains. But the size and scope of the Yamato state is still debated among historians, and it likely fluctuated throughout this period. Some scholars argue that the Yamato state only controlled parts of western and southern Japan, while others argue that it controlled most of the archipelago. This debate has led to the co-called Big versus Little Yamato controversy. Big Yamato theorists believe that the Yamato state was large and powerful from the beginning of the Kofun period, while Little Yamato theorists argue that the Yamato state was small and weak and gradually grew in power over time. Regardless, the Yamato clan did establish some degree of political authority over the other regional elites and began to lay the foundations for a centralized state. Now, during the Kofun period, Japan's population grew rapidly due to improved agricultural productivity and the introduction of iron tools and weapons. This population growth led to increased urbanization and the emergence of new social classes. The Kofun period also saw the emergence of a powerful warrior aristocracy known as the Uji, which were patrilineal clans that controlled land and labor and had military power. Uji were originally local elites who had been granted land by the Yamato clan in exchange for their loyalty and military service, but they eventually became hereditary and acquired more rights and privileges. Eventually, they even came to dominate the imperial court, and many of them held important government positions. Over time, this class distinction would lead to factionalism and conflict within the ruling elite. The second thing that defined this period was the construction of giant burial mounds known as Kofun. So these burial mounds were actually quite large, ranging from a few dozen to over 450 feet in length, and often containing multiple burials. The largest of these mounds, known as the Ki Kofun, are actually among the largest earthen tombs in the world. It's believed that the Kofun were built for members of the ruling elite, including emperors, and were meant to symbolize their power and status. The construction of the Kofun required a massive amount of labor and resources, and is thought to have been a way of mobilizing the population and demonstrating the authority of the state. The Kofun were also often built on top of earlier, smaller burial mounds, reflecting the growing scale and complexity of society. The construction of these elaborate tombs reflects the increasing wealth and power of the ruling elite during the Kofun period. These tombs were actually made by piling up huge amounts of dirt and stone over the remains of the dead person, and some of them even contained actual treasure and artifacts. The third thing that defined this period was the formation of the Yamato state. As I already mentioned before, the Yamato clan established the Yamato state around the middle of the 3rd century, after they conquered the Kibi Plain, which is now part of the Kansai region. From there, they continued to expand their influence throughout the archipelago. During the Kofun period, the Yamato clan took further steps to centralize political power. They established a hereditary monarchy with the emperor as the supreme leader and created a system of provincial governors known as fudoki to administer the provinces. Although much of this is speculation based on later sources, it's generally accepted that the Yamato clan was successful in establishing some degree of centralized authority. But again, the degree of control and the extent of the Yamato state's power is still debated among historians. Despite these efforts at centralization, local lords still held significant power, and the Yamato state remained weak and decentralized compared to the states in China and Korea. Nonetheless, the Kofun period represents an important step in the development of Japanese political institutions and cultural identity. Okay, so we talked about how this was the period when powerful warrior aristocracy emerged, and that was due to the fact that the population grew significantly. That growth is what allowed for the emergence of specialized labor and social stratification, and the warrior aristocracy known as the Uji emerged as protectors of the state and its people. Members of the Uji were granted land and resources in exchange for their military service and loyalty, and they quickly became a powerful force in Japanese society. Their power and influence grew throughout the Kofun period as the Yamato state expanded, and they eventually came to dominate the imperial court and hold important government positions. They also played a crucial role in the construction of the giant burial mounds, or Kofun, which were built for members of the ruling elite, including emperors. These elaborate tombs demonstrated the wealth and power of the ruling class and served as a reminder of their noble status. But wait, there's more. Not only were the Kofun impressive feats of engineering, but they also reflected the growing scale and complexity of Japanese society. Each mound required a massive amount of labor and resources to construct, and they were often built on top of earlier, smaller burial mounds. This practice, known as cyclic superimposition, reflected the growing wealth and power of the ruling elite. The Kofun period also saw the emergence of a number of important cultural developments. One of these was the adoption of the Chinese writing system, which allowed for the recording of history and the transmission of knowledge. This development had a profound impact on Japanese culture and is considered a key moment in its early history. Another important cultural development was the spread of Buddhism from Korea, which eventually became the dominant religion in Japan. These developments, along with the emergence of a powerful warrior aristocracy and the construction of giant burial mounds or kofun, define the Kofun period in Japanese history. This was a time of great change and upheaval as Japan transitioned from a small tribe of chiefdoms to a more centralized and complex state. The legacy of the Kofun period can still be seen today in the landscape of Japan, with the numerous burial mounds that are scattered throughout the country. Alright guys, that was a quick overview of the Kofun period in Japanese history. If you want to keep learning about Asia, check out the playlist to the right. And thanks for watching. (38 to 710 CE), the Asuka period. Let's look at Buddhism in Japan, the Taika reforms, the establishment of a centralized government, and the conflict between Buddhist and Shinto traditions during the Kofun period. If you like this episode, be sure to check out the playlist for more episodes about ancient Japan. Let's get started. Let's start off with a map of Japan to see where we are. Here is the southernmost of the three main islands of Japan, Okinawa. To the north of Okinawa is the island of Shikoku, and then the largest island of Japan, Honshu. On Honshu, we have the Kofu Basin in the middle of the island, surrounded by mountains and open to the sea. And here is the Yamato capital in the Kofu Basin. So now let's move back to our timeline and see what was happening at this time. From around 200 to 538 CE, Japan was in the Kofun period. The Kofun were huge burial mounds built over the graves of important people. We saw how the rulers were trying to look more Chinese with their clothes and their hairstyles. They were adopting titles like emperor and empress. But when it came to religion, they still practiced their native religion called Shintoism. In 538 CE, a prince named Shotoku Taishi returned from China with 18 tons of Buddhist scriptures and 50 monks. A few years later, in 552, he brought back 100 monks and a giant statue of Buddha. At this point, there was a lot of interest in Buddhism throughout Japan. After these missions, Shotoku hosted a conference to discuss Buddhism. He invited 6 monks who had traveled to China to study, and they discussed things like the caste system in India, the different types of meditation, and how to run a temple. Shotoku continued to support Buddhism, and it became the official religion of the state in 589 CE. After this, some Buddhists began converting local leaders to their faith and building temples all over Japan. Some of the temples were simple huts, but others were huge complexes that took decades to build. One example is the Horyuji Temple, which was built in 607 CE. It was one of the first large temples in Japan and has been designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site. In 607 CE, the first Buddhist nunnery was founded by Prince Shotoku. He also introduced a new calendar based on the Gregorian calendar. However, the old lunar calendar was still used alongside the new one. In 624, an influential empress named Suiko adopted the title of Tenno, which means Shining One or Heavenly Sovereign. She was the first woman to hold this title, and this was right after the Buddha's death in 543 BCE. So maybe they thought this would help legitimize her rule. Her son Jito was the 29th emperor of Japan. When he came into power, there was a civil war taking place. Jito gave his mother full authority while he went to live as a monk. Suiko defeated her enemies, bringing the country together. But now there was a problem. Before the Taika reforms, most of the power was held by regional lords. This made it difficult for the central government to raise an army or collect taxes. Only about 1/3 of the land was owned by the imperial court. To fix this, in 645 CE, they carried out the Taika reforms. Taika means great change or change of times, and this was exactly what happened in Japan. The Taika reforms were inspired by China and were led by powerful regional lords. Fujiwara no Kamatari was a key figure in carrying out the reforms. His family would go on to become the most powerful clan in Japan for the next 200 years. Here's a chart showing some of the changes that took place during the Taika reforms. First, they changed the title of emperor to Tenno, meaning sovereign of heaven. Next, they created 8 provinces to raise taxes and conscript soldiers. Also, they wanted to make sure the emperor had control of the military. So they created 2 ministries, one to manage the army and one to manage the navy. They also established a census to keep track of the population. Land was redistributed to people who worked on the farms, kind of like a communist idea. And instead of the old title of Uji, referring to hereditary nobility, they created a title called Shinogi, meaning new class, who were ranked according to the amount of rice they owned. Finally, they wanted to control the spread of Buddhism, so they placed it under the authority of the provincial governors. After these reforms, Japan looked much more like a centralized state similar to China. Instead of having so many regional lords, most of the power was now in the hands of the central government. Now let's talk about the flying boat. In 646 CE, a fleet of 3,000 ships set sail from Iki Island near Korea. Their mission was to invade the Korean peninsula. Many Koreans had escaped to Ike and asked for help. Their request was granted, and the Japanese army set off to help them. They sailed through the Tsushima Strait, but a storm sank almost the entire fleet. The Japanese did win the battle against the Koreans, but they lost most of their navy. This defeat caused people to question the new government policies. Even though this wasn't really a great victory, they kept trying year after year. And in 663, they finally won a big battle at Baekgang River. This is a famous painting depicting the battle. The Japanese were outnumbered 3-1, but they still won. According to legend, there was a general named Jimmy no Hikaru no Mikoto who rallied the troops before the battle and then led a nighttime attack. This painting shows that battle. Another interesting thing about this painting is that it was drawn by Tosa Emmatividade, who was a painter in the Tosa school of painting. This school was an aristocratic group of painters who painted mostly for the imperial court. Unfortunately, the Japanese Empire didn't last long. In 672, an earthquake destroyed the capital city. It was rebuilt, but in 708, it burned down again. So it was moved to Heian, which would later become Kyoto. The capital was finally stable and ready to flourish. So now let's talk about the Tenpyo era. In 710, the Empress Genmei stepped down and passed the throne to her son, Emperor Shomu. During his reign, Buddhism flourished and reached its peak. Soon after he came into power, he married a woman named Koken, who would become one of the most powerful women in Japanese history. One of the first things Koken did was build a massive Buddhist temple complex. It was called the Todaiji Temple and is still standing today. Inside is the world's largest bronze Buddha statue. It stands at over 50 feet tall and weighs 500 tons. That's about the size of an 8-ton elephant. Here's another picture of it, and here is what the temple looks like today. It's still a working Buddhist temple. Emperor Shomu declared 710 CE as the first year of the new era of Tenpyo. He also promoted talented people to influential positions regardless of their social status. Under his rule, Japan experienced peace, prosperity, and economic growth. But after Shomu died, Koken took control of the government and became a dictatorial empress. She persecuted those who followed her political rivals and even had some executed. The people were exhausted from all the fighting and paying taxes for the military campaigns, so they weren't very happy with the empress. Then in 715, the capital was moved again, this time to Nagaoka. Once again, a fire destroyed the city and the capital was moved to Heian. In 794, this would later become the city of Kyoto. So that brings us to the end of the Asuka period. Click here to learn about the Nara period, or click here to learn about the ancient kingdom of Korea. As always, if you like this episode, be sure to like and share. And thank you for watching. Nara period, 710-794 CE. The year is 710 CE. and the Japanese capital has just been moved to the city of Nara. A large portion of this city was set aside for the seat of government, but also for housing the country's first university and its various Buddhist temples. This new capital would become the center of culture, politics, and religion for all of Japan, and would last for over 80 years, until the year 794, when it was moved again. This era of Japanese history is known as the Nara period. Nara was the first capital of Japan that can truly be called permanent. Before then, the imperial court had been moving around quite a bit, following the emperors wherever they went. But now things were different. The capital was no longer intended to follow the emperor on his travels, but instead the emperor was expected to rule from the capital. While there were some minor changes to where the seat of government was located within Nara, the city itself remained the capital for the rest of Japanese history. During the Nara period, a lot of important things happened. For example, the compilation of the Kojiki and Nihon Shoki, which are Japan's first written records, the introduction of Buddhism into the realm of politics, and finally the creation of the first Japanese university. These three topics are so big that we'll need to do an entire series about them. But for today, we're going to focus on how the Nara period ended. While the city of Nara is famous for being Japan's first true capital city, and for the many amazing temples that were built there, it's also known for being corrupt. During the last decades of the period, the capital was filled with eunuchs who prostituted themselves, with nobles who bribed their way into powerful positions, and with Buddhist monks who used their influence to get rich. In addition, there were two rival clans that were always trying to one-up each other, causing more problems. All of these issues combined together caused the end of the Nara period and the beginning of the Heian period. But let's go over each of these issues individually to understand why they were such a problem. The first issue was the many corrupt officials. This wasn't anything new to the Japanese at this point, because ever since the first capital had been established in the year 1663, the local governors had been sending people to serve the central government. The thing was, these people weren't exactly the most qualified people for the job. Most of them were related to the royal family in some way or another, and they got their position by knowing the right people and giving lots of bribes. It was extremely rare that someone would work their way up through the ranks of the bureaucracy based on merit. So a lot of people who worked in the government didn't really know what they were doing. They also weren't very honest. When collecting taxes, for example, they would often take some of that money for themselves without giving the rest of it to the emperor. This was tolerated for a long time because it was common practice in China. Since the Japanese had adopted many of their political practices from China, they thought it normal to keep some of the taxes for themselves. However, as time passed and the Japanese started to see the negative effects of having such a corrupt government, they began to want change. This brings us to our second issue, the Buddhist clergy. You see, while the Japanese were accepting of the Chinese practices of taking bribes and not really caring about qualifications, they drew the line at something else the Chinese did, and that was giving too much power to the Buddhist monks. Now, this isn't to say that the Chinese gave all of the important government positions to Buddhist monks. That would have been impossible because most monks didn't even know how to read or write. However, they did give them a lot of power, especially when it came to politics. In fact, during the Sui and Tang periods of China, there were many Buddhist monks who held important government positions and used their power to do good things. There's a famous story about an Indian monk named Bodhiruchi, who was invited to the Chinese court to translate Buddhist scriptures. Because he couldn't read Chinese, he was given a noble title and thousands of attendants to help him. After he finished translating the scriptures, he became famous throughout the empire and was summoned by the emperor to come and serve him. He declined the emperor's invitation and returned to India. While this is only one story, and there were many others like it, you can see that the Chinese really did give a lot of power to the Buddhist monks. The Japanese, however, did not like this and would never accept it in their own country. Instead, they kept the Buddhist monks out of politics. They weren't allowed to own property or join any of the government organizations. This led to the Buddhist monks becoming very resentful because they felt like they weren't able to contribute to society. To make matters worse, the Shinto priests hated the Buddhists and everything they stood for. They constantly insulted the Buddhist monks and wouldn't allow them to build temples anywhere near their own shrines. As you can imagine, this created a lot of tension between the two groups, and when the Buddhist monks felt like they had enough, they retaliated. This leads us to the next issue, the Fujiwara clan. If you don't remember, the capital had been moved to Nara in the year 710. This meant that everyone had to move there, including the wealthy landowners who lived in the surrounding areas. One of these families was the Fujiwara clan, who controlled a large amount of land and influence. When the capital was moved, they saw it as an opportunity to gain even more power. So they began to buy up all of the property around the palace. Then they started building temples on their land and donating them to Buddhist monks, who in turn would pray for the Fujiwara clan every day. Soon the Fujiwara clan had so much power that the emperor was practically a puppet in their hands. This made the other wealthy landowners very angry, especially the Nakatomi clan, who were rivals of the Fujiwara. They started to team up with the Shinto priests and Buddhist monks to try and take down the Fujiwara clan. This created a lot of tension and conflict within the court, and it all came to a head in the year 764. The Nakatomi clan was so fed up with the Fujiwara clan's shenanigans that they decided to take action. They started by bribing the emperor's wife and children, then waited for their chance to strike. When it came, they took control of the government and banished the Fujiwara clan from the capital. Now you might think that this would have been a happy ending, but it wasn't. You see, by this point, the constant fighting and corruption had completely destroyed the Nara period. The capital was in ruins and the entire country was in chaos. At this point, no one wanted to be a part of the government anymore. Even the emperor gave up his throne and retired to a monastery. In the end, it was up to a young man named Kamu to save the country. He took the throne and moved the capital to a new location, bringing an end to the Nara period. But wait a minute, if the Nara period ended in 794, how could you possibly still be alive? Well, that's because the narrator of this video is actually a time traveler from the future. He's been studying the history of Japan for many years now and is writing a book about it. However, he's running out of time and needs your help. Please like and subscribe so he can finish his research before he goes back to his own time. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you next time. The Heian period, 794 to 1185 CE, is considered to be the golden age of traditional Japanese culture. In this period, we see the rise of Kyoto as the imperial capital, the flourishing of aristocratic culture, the height of Japanese court life, the development of kana, a native Japanese script, and the beginnings of the samurai class. However, it was also during this time that imperial power waned and rival regional governments grew in strength, eventually culminating in the destruction of the Heian court. So let's explore how the Heian court developed from its humble beginnings into a cultural powerhouse before getting overthrown by the very thing it created. Welcome to my channel. The Heian period began with the establishment of a new imperial capital at Heian-kyo, now called Kyoto, which was intended to be a fresh start for Japan after a century of civil war. The previous capital at Nagaoka had been destroyed in 764 when an invading force from the northern half of Honshu, the main island, sacked the city. Now, while this was not the first time that Japan's capital had been sacked, it was the last straw for Empress Shotoku, who decided that if you can't beat 'em, join 'em. She relocated her court northwards to Heian-kyo, taking the enemy's weapons away and turning them against them. This new location was favorable because it was right in the middle of the three largest islands of Japan and close to China, through which many goods and ideas flowed. And so the empire began a new chapter in its history, centered around this new capital. In 802, Emperor Kamu established Buddhism as a state religion and named Heian-kyo the permanent capital of Japan. Over the next 2 centuries, it flourished into a cosmopolitan city filled with aristocrats, scholars, artisans, and merchants. The aristocracy enjoyed refined material comforts, beautiful gardens, poetry readings, calligraphy, and art. It was truly the height of courtly culture in Japan. And if you want a good example of this, look no further than the tale of Genji. This epic novel, written by Murasaki Shikibu in the early 11th century, is considered to be the world's first novel, complete with a compelling plot, rounded characters, and continuous prose narrative. Set during the Heian period, The tale of Genji tells the story of Prince Genji and his descendants over several generations. The story follows the romantic and family relationships of the elite courtiers and gives us an intimate glimpse into the manners, customs, arts, and culture of the Heian court. For example, in the story, the main character, Genji, goes on a trip to visit his dying father, the emperor, and along the way, he meets a man named Ukifune, who becomes one of his concubines. They spend a night together and then part ways. But later, when the emperor dies and Genji takes the throne, he cannot forget Ukifune and goes searching for her. He finds her working as a low-level court official and is taken aback by her beauty and intelligence. Despite the difference in their social status, they fall in love, and she becomes one of his most trusted advisors. The tale of Genji is a masterpiece of world literature and a window into the complex world of the Heian court. Another aspect of life during the Heian period was the development of kana. By the late 8th century, Chinese characters had been used in Japan for several hundred years, but they were primarily used for official and religious purposes. The common people used a spoken language called kotoba. Kotoba was not written down because it was not considered proper to write phonetically. However, by the mid-8th century, the need to record spoken language became apparent, and so the kana syllabary was developed. There are two types of kana, manyote and gagaku. Many of the characters of manyote kana resemble those of Chinese, but over time they have simplified and become more phonetic. Manyote kana was used alongside Chinese characters until the 19th century. Gagaku kana, on the other hand, is a native Japanese script that consists of 46 phonetic characters. The development of kana was a significant development in the history of Japanese writing because it allowed for the recording of the spoken language and helped to preserve much of Heian literature. Before kana, most Japanese literature was written in Chinese characters, which were cumbersome to use for writing spoken Japanese. As a result, much of pre-kana Japanese literature is in the form of poetry or brief prose texts. The development of kana led to the flourishing of Japanese literature during the Heian period, as well as the emergence of a distinct Japanese style of writing. However, despite this flourishing of culture, the Heian court was in sharp decline. While emperors were still considered divine, the reality of their power was far from it. The emperor held little real power and was surrounded by regents and court nobles who ran the government in his place. The court nobility were hereditary and consisted of the Fujiwara clan and other aristocratic families. The Fujiwara clan in particular held immense influence over the imperial court and were instrumental in the appointment of regents and advisors. They also controlled the most important government offices and used their power to enrich themselves and their allies. To maintain their power, the Fujiwara clan implemented a series of measures. One of these was the introduction of the Shizoku system, which limited the emperor's authority to purely religious matters. This effectively made the emperor a figurehead and gave the Fujiwara clan and other court nobles control over the government. Additionally, the clan introduced a number of reforms aimed at strengthening the central government and standardizing administrative procedures. These reforms, however, only served to increase the power of the Fujiwara clan and other court nobles. Outside of the court, another problem was brewing. The Heian court had been largely ineffective in dealing with the threat posed by the Taira and Minamoto clans. These two powerful families dominated the western and northern regions of Japan respectively, and had grown increasingly independent of the central government. They also maintained private armies of samurai, a new class of professional warriors who were emerging in Japan during this time. Samurai had traditionally been provincial military retainers who owed their allegiance to local lords rather than the emperor. However, as the Heian court's authority waned, the samurai began to assert their independence and carve out larger roles for themselves in Japanese society. The Taira and Minamoto clans quickly gained prominence and power, becoming the most dominant families in Japan. They commanded large armies of samurai and were willing to use them to achieve their goals. In 1160, the rivalry between the Taira and Minamoto clans culminated in the Genpei War. The war was fought over control of the imperial court and the right to appoint the shogun, the military leader of Japan. The Taira clan emerged victorious, but their triumph was short-lived. In 1180, the Minamoto launched a counterattack, leading to the Battle of Dan no Ura in 1185. The Minamoto samurai, led by Minamoto no Yoritomo, decisively defeated the Taira, ending their clan's dominance and establishing the Kamakura Shogunate, which marked the beginning of the samurai era in Japan. The Taira clan's defeat at the Battle of Dan no Ura was a turning point in Japanese history. It signified the end of the Heian period and the beginning of the medieval period in Japan. The samurai who had been loyal to the Minamoto clan became the new rulers of Japan, and the Heian court's influence over the country rapidly declined. The cultural achievements of the Heian court were admired and emulated throughout Japan's history. However, the court's failure to adapt to the changing circumstances of medieval Japan ultimately led to its downfall. If you like this video, check out our other videos on the samurai and feudal Japan. And don't forget to subscribe for more epic stories. The Heian period was a golden age for Japan, known for its elegant court culture. But beyond the imperial court, things were very different. Powerful local lords called samurai had taken control of most of the country. They built huge estates and assembled armies to enforce their rule. And soon one of these warlords would take the title of shogun, meaning military governor, and establish the first shogunate in Japan. This is the story of how the samurai took over Japan and the beginning of the Tokugawa shogunate. This is a samurai sword from the Kamakura period. It's very different from the katana of later centuries. It has a long handle and a very thick blade. This sword is a symbol of a new era in Japanese history, an era of war and change. In 1185, a samurai named Minamoto no Yoritomo led his clan to victory in a civil war against the Taira clan. Yoritomo established a military government in the city of Kamakura and became the first shogun. The shogunate took control of the entire country, except for the immediate area around the imperial court. From his new capital in Kamakura, Yoritomo set out to consolidate his power. He established a new legal code and a system of provincial governors to enforce the laws. He also created a powerful military force consisting of samurai warriors. In 1274, the Mongols invaded Japan, but their fleet was destroyed in a typhoon, which some accounts claim was a divine wind that saved Japan, or kamikaze. The Japanese were prepared for the second Mongol invasion in 1281, and though fierce battles were fought, the invaders were again defeated by the kamikaze. These events led to the creation of a new religion, Shintoism, which emphasized the uniqueness and superiority of the Japanese people. Another cultural development during this time was the rise of Zen Buddhism, which had been brought to Japan from China. Zen was popular among the samurai class, who found its emphasis on meditation and self-discipline appealing. In fact, many samurai followed the way of the warrior Bushido, which emphasized loyalty, courage, and self-sacrifice. The Kamakura period was a time of great change and upheaval in Japan. The old aristocratic order was broken and a new military elite took its place. The samurai became the dominant force in Japanese society, and their way of life, Bushido, became an important part of Japanese culture. But this new military government also faced challenges from within and outside the country. The Mongol invasions tested the strength of the young shogunate, but also led to the development of a strong sense of national identity. As Japan entered the next century, the stage was set for the rise of a new shogunate that would rule Japan for centuries to come. Japan's history is not just about the rise of the Tokugawa shoguns or the fall of the samurai to Western guns in the Meiji era. Japan's medieval period was a hotbed for power struggles between rival clans. The Heian court was ruled over by aristocratic families who had been in power since the introduction of Chinese culture into the archipelago. But their refined and cultured lifestyle left them ill-prepared to deal with these threats. Eventually, a new military class rose up to take their place. This would become the samurai class. And after a civil war between two powerful clans, this new warrior class would take control of the country and establish the first shogunate. Let's learn more about it in today's episode of Shogunate. Our story today begins in the late Heian period. In the previous episode, we talked about how the Taira clan grew in power, eventually taking control of the emperor and the government. This set up a power struggle with another aristocratic military family, the Minamoto clan. Both of these clans were originally from the Fujiwara clan, which had supplied many emperors to the throne during the Heian period. So what went wrong? In the early years, the Taira were able to keep the Minamoto in check, but the latter clan was able to regroup and launch a campaign to defeat their rivals once and for all. The war that followed is known as the Genpei War. It would last 4 years from 1180 to 1185 and be fought across Japan, including battles on land and sea. Some sources say the war started with an insult to Minamoto no Yoshinaka, a young samurai lord of the Minamoto clan who was called a country bumpkin by the Taira courtiers. That might have been the spark, but there was definitely tension between the two clans at the time. Eventually, the conflict boiled over. One key figure of the Minamoto clan, Minamoto no Yoritomo, seized key territory in the eastern provinces and then turned to conquer the capital. He sent his most trusted samurai, a man named Taira no Kiyomori, to attack the Taira forces. Kiyomori defeated the Taira at the Battle of Uji. Then he returned to Kamakura to solidify his position. At the same time, one of Yoritomo's younger brothers, Yoshitsune, was advancing west from his base in northern Japan. Yoshitsune defeated the Taira at the Battle of Fujigawa, and soon afterwards at the Battle of Dan no Ura. The Taira forces were led by no other than Kiyomori himself. He would go down in history as the greatest samurai of the age. But it wasn't enough to save the Taira clan. As a result of these battles, the Taira lost control of the central government and were forced to flee. However, the war was not yet over. While Kiyomori secured Yoritomo's rear in the east, Yoritomo and Yoshitsune pursued the Taira remnants west. The final confrontation took place at the Battle of the Shijiao River. After 5 hours of fighting, the Taira were decisively defeated. Only a handful of survivors escaped across the sea to the Korean peninsula. For his role in the war, Yoritomo was given the title shogun by Emperor Gojo. The term literally means general, but it would come to mean military dictator. This was the end of the Heian period and the beginning of the Kamakura period, which lasted until 1333. As shogun, Yoritomo moved his court to Kamakura in 1192. There he established a new government based on Confucian ideas and modeled after the Chinese governments of old. Just like those ancient Chinese rulers, Yoritomo installed a series of offices to run the government. Instead of the chancellor system used in the Heian period, however, he used a chief minister, which is why the Bakufu, the shogun's court, is sometimes called the Shogukyo, meaning administration of the shogun. But Yoritomo didn't stop there. He also created a council of regents, a council of advisors, a censor, a board of judges, a tribunal, and even a secret police force. These structures provided a foundation for the authoritarian style of government that would characterize the shogunates of the future. He also reformed the military along the Chinese model, organizing the troops into a standing army under the direct control of the shogun. He standardized weapons and armor and created a merit-based promotion system. Under the new system, the highest positions of power were reserved for the military elite of the samurai class, not for members of the old aristocratic class. Even the emperor was required to swear fealty to the shogun. Yoritomo was the first to hold the title shogun and the first of the military dictators of Japan. He died in 1199. His son, Minamoto no Sanetomo, continued his father's policies, expanding the power of the shogunate and reforming the law. However, Sanetomo was assassinated in 1222. His brother, Hojo Tokimune, became shogun, but because he was only 12 years old when he took the title, a regent was appointed to rule in his stead. This was a member of the Hojo clan, a distant relative of Yoritomo. The regency was supposed to be temporary, but it would last for 60 years. The Hojo family held real power behind the scenes while the nominal shogun continued to rule. They did this by monopolizing access to the important administrative offices. This arrangement would become the standard for the rest of the shogunates. From now on, members of the shogun's family would continue to serve as shoguns, but the real power would lie with the ruling Hojo clan. But before we get into that, let me tell you about our sponsor, Masterworks. Art is one of the oldest asset classes, and for the longest time, the only way to invest in art was to buy a painting yourself. Now you can own a piece of Banksy for the fraction of the price with Masterworks. During the reign of the Hojo clan, the samurai class reached its peak. Warriors from all over Japan came to Kamakura to pledge service to the shogun. They lived in barracks near the shogun's court and were paid salaries to maintain order and carry out the shogun's orders. Over time, they formed a tight-knit community with its own customs and traditions. Most samurai were retainers of daimyo, local lords who pledged service to the shogun in exchange for land. The daimyo granted portions of their land to lesser samurai as hereditary grants in exchange for military service. The lower samurai served as foot soldiers, while the higher ranks served as administrators and judges. A small percentage of samurai were directly employed by the shogunate. They were usually high-ranking warriors who received their positions as personal appointments from the shogun. Either way, samurai were bound to their superiors by a strict code of loyalty. They expected absolute obedience in return for protection and support. One could lose face or even their life for failing to live up to the ideals of Bushido, the way of the samurai. It wasn't just warfare and politics that kept the samurai busy, however. The warrior class was also patrons of art and literature. Many samurai followed Zen Buddhism and enjoyed poetry, calligraphy, and flower arrangement. During this time, Zen gardens reached their classical form and the art of origami developed. But not everyone appreciated this flourishing of culture. Zen Buddhism was seen as a threat by some quarters of society. Members of the old aristocratic class worried that the samurai obsession with martial arts would lead to instability. They also complained about the growing influence of merchants, whose wealth rivaled that of some daimyo. Meanwhile, the Mongols were preparing to invade Japan. The first Mongol invasion force arrived in 1274. They landed on the island of Tsushima and fought against the local lord, but they were driven back to their ships by the samurai. They tried again in 1281 with a much larger force, but the result was the same. The Mongols retreated after suffering heavy losses. What saved Japan from the Mongols was a typhoon. Some called it a divine wind or kamikaze. This event was later used to promote a cult of Japanese exceptionalism, which claimed that the islands were blessed by the gods and destined to be the center of the world. This brings us to the end of the Kamakura period in 1333. Join me next time to find out what happened next. Until then, remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you haven't already. Check out my social media for news and updates. And thanks to all my supporters for your continued support. If you would like to support the channel, please visit the links below. The Muromachi period in Japan lasted from 1336 to 1573 CE. It was during this time that the arts flourished with the creation of No theater and the tea ceremony. But it was also at this time that Japan fractured into hundreds of small warring states. The Portuguese arrived with guns and God. So let's explore this period of Japanese history together. After the Kamakura shogunate fell in 1333, the Emperor Go-Daigo came back to power, starting the period known as the Northern Court. He ruled from Kyoto and promoted the arts and culture, while giving the title of shogun to an imperial prince named Takauji Ashikaga. This made it seem like the emperor was giving out the shogunate as a reward, rather than having the shogun appoint the emperor, which is how it had been since the first shogun, Minamoto no Yoritomo. Takauji founded his own dynasty, the Ashikaga shogunate, which would last for over 3 centuries. The new government was located in the city of Muromachi, which gave its name to this entire period. Soon after he took office, though, Takauji led a campaign against the remnants of the Hojo clan in the Kanto region, crushed them, and resettled many of the survivors in the newly conquered lands. This was done mostly to prevent any future uprisings, but also to show the daimyo of the other regions that the new shogun wasn't to be messed with. Ashikaga also implemented a series of laws and regulations throughout the country, including standards for farming, taxes, and punishments. For the next 2 generations, peace reigned across most of Japan, and culture flourished. Works of art from this period often reflect this peace and focus on nature. Gardens became very popular around this time as well, with the famous Zen gardens being an example. One of the biggest cultural exports of the Muromachi period was No theater. It originated from the Chinese and Korean forms of mask dance drama. During the first half of the period, Several notable works were produced by the playwright Zayami Motokyo, who is considered one of the greatest playwrights in the history of Noh. These plays focused on historical events, or myths and legends, with each featuring a specific type of mask that defined the character wearing it. The style of Noh has remained largely unchanged since it was created, and today it is still performed throughout Japan, especially during religious festivals. Another cultural export of the Ashikaga era was the tea ceremony. It was developed by the famous Zen monk and tea master Sen-no Rikyu, who sought to make the drinking of tea a spiritual experience. Today, the tea ceremony is an important part of Japanese culture and continues to be practiced all over the world. Unfortunately for the Ashikaga family, they are also responsible for what is known as the Onin War, which marked the end of the peaceful Muromachi era and started the Sengoku Jidai, also known as the Warring States period. In 1467, a dispute arose between the Shogun Ashikaga and Yamana Soken, a powerful daimyo from the Uchi clan. Several large battles took place over the next few years, resulting in the burning of Kyoto and the death of the 8th shogun. With the central government weakened, regional warlords grew more powerful. But before we get into that, now back to the video. The fighting didn't stop there though. After the shogun's death, rival clans fought to replace him and take control of the government. By 1473, the war had reached such a point that the Ashikaga shogun was forced to flee to the north, where he would later die. The following year, another candidate for shogun was chosen, but he too would flee rather than deal with the ongoing conflict. By this point, it was clear that the central government was no longer able to control the country. Each powerful warlord was effectively ruling their own independent domain. This situation would last for the next 100 years, until Oda Nobunaga finally brought most of Japan under his rule. This time of constant warfare saw some major technological changes as well, including the introduction of firearms. It's believed that the Portuguese were the first to introduce guns to Japan when they arrived in the 1540s. They had actually been there a few decades earlier, but due to conflicts in China, their ships were blown off course, landing in the small village of Anjimasu. Here they encountered the Portuguese trader, Francis Xavier, who had come to the island to preach Christianity. The locals were fascinated by these foreigners and their advanced technology. And once the word got out about the big boats and loud noises, everyone wanted one. In fact, the Portuguese were so successful with sales that they actually began trading with Chinese pirates, selling them guns and other merchandise. This was great for business, but it wasn't so good for the local population. With the sudden influx of firearms, more and more people began dying from gun-related accidents. The Portuguese quickly realized that they had kind of unleashed something horrible and tried to stop the spread of firearms by only selling them to the Chinese junk ships that would then take them back to China. But this didn't really work because the Japanese quickly got the idea that guns were cool and started making their own. The Japanese firearms weren't nearly as advanced as the ones from Portugal, but they were still effective. By the end of the century, the daimyo were using guns and cannons in open warfare. Of course, this changed the way battles were fought, and those with access to firearms had a significant advantage. The Portuguese weren't the only ones bringing new ideas to Japan either. During their travels throughout Asia, they picked up Islam along the way, which they then introduced to the Japanese. However, the main religion introduced to Japan during the Muromachi period was Christianity. As mentioned earlier, Francis Xavier had landed in Japan in 1549 and began preaching Christianity to anyone who would listen. For a while, things were going pretty well. The daimyo were impressed by the Portuguese and their fancy new guns, and if converting to Christianity meant getting more of them, then why not? In fact, several daimyo converted, including the infamous Date clan, who even adopted European styles of dress. Unfortunately, the good relationship between the Portuguese and the Japanese wouldn't last long. In 1555, the Portuguese ship carrying the new Jesuit missionaries arrived with a strange message. They claimed that the previous missionaries were enemies of the King of Portugal and ordered all of them to leave the country immediately. The Portuguese also went ahead and destroyed several churches and prohibited the Japanese from practicing Christianity. This was a move to protect their valuable trade secrets and prevent the Chinese and others from learning about their firearms. But it also left a bad taste in the mouth of the Japanese who had grown accustomed to the luxuries of Christianity. This paved the way for the next group of missionaries who arrived 4 years later. They were from Spain and Italy, and they didn't have any political strings attached. This time, however, the Christians faced persecution, and many of them chose to hide, rather than abandon their faith. This secret sect would become known as the Kokoro Kirishitan, or Hidden Christians. Despite the hardship they faced, Christianity continued to grow in Japan, and by the early 1600s, there were hundreds of thousands of Japanese Christians, but that's going to have to be another video. So as we can see, the Muromachi period was a time of great cultural achievement, but it was also a time of great upheaval. The introduction of firearms and Christianity by Portuguese traders would have a profound impact on Japanese society, and this combined with the collapse of the Ashikaga Shogunate led to a century of warfare throughout the country. But what do you think? How did you like this video? Let me know in the comments below. Also, please remember to check out our support page. We have some really cool perks over there, and your help is always appreciated. Thanks for watching.